Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you are all doing really well. Today we are going to be talking about the flat arc and how it interacts with story structure. So the flat arc is an arc where the character does not grow. If you didn't watch my previous video on the flat arc, I highly recommend that you watch that first before this video so that you just have a better understanding of how it works and sort of what we're talking about in general. I also recommend that you watch my general story structure video first. You don't absolutely have to, but I think that it would help you a lot with understanding what we're talking about in this video. So I will link to those videos in the description. I'll also link to some other possibly helpful videos just in case there's something else you're looking for. But today we are going to go over the structure of just the first half. I cut a lot out of this video and I worked really hard on it to try to make it as understandable as possible in as short of a time as possible, but it is going to be quite a hefty, dense video, even though we're only going to be going over half. So I do have notes I'm going to reference here. It's mostly just going to be podcast style, so feel free to not look at the screen or do something else at the same time. There's not going to be anything to look at. I'm not going to put any graphics up or anything like that, so feel free to only listen. If you are worried about spoilers, I am going to be using films as the examples in this video as well. And I know some of you love the film examples and some of you would have preferred examples from novels because I do primarily teach and work with novelists. The reason that I have gone with films is because if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a lot easier for you to watch a couple films and catch up than it is to spend 10 hours or 15 hours reading a novel or two to catch up. And it's just a lot easier to find more straightforward or clearer explanations that I can convey quickly. There's a lot more to convey in a novel. I do want to do novel breakdown sometime in the future, but I am trying to make these videos as short and comprehensible for you guys as possible, so that's why. But if you're worried about spoilers, I'm going to be talking about Paddington 2, Legally Blonde, Whale Rider, Gattaca, and Matilda. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the structure. So we are going to start with the first quarter, of course, and the first quarter is about 20 to 25% of your story. I personally do find that flat arc stories sometimes tip into the longer end, so often closer to 25%. You may find using that full quarter instead of for the positive arc. You could see it either way, but more typically I think we lean a little shorter. So I do think the flat arc leans a little longer. It's not a hard and fast rule though, so you should do what makes sense for your book, but don't worry if you are hitting that higher end. The first the first beat in the first quarter is the status quo. The status quo is where we want to set up that basic information about the characters, about the world, what's going on, what their life looks like in general. In the overview of the flat arc, we talked about how the flat arc stories are about society holding a belief that goes against the flat arc protagonist. So the flat arc protagonists are stories about a character who doesn't fit in, who just doesn't really feel suited to their world. Often there's a strong sense of sort of discrimination against them or prejudice against them. Sometimes, or even often, this is for intrinsic traits, something that they didn't even choose. So while they will have their belief, often they're fundamentally judged just based on something that is intrinsic, something they don't even have control over. So, for example, Gattaca is about a near future society where babies are genetically selected. And the protagonist in that story, Vincent, was not genetically selected, and as a result, he was born in the supposedly genetic lower class. So he's just sort of fundamentally judged for having lesser quality or worse DNA. And that's, of course, something that he didn't choose. It's not his belief. He does have a belief, but that is just a fundamental discrimination against him. Similarly, we've all probably watched Matilda. Matilda was born hyper intelligent and also with a sort of a telekinetic supernatural ability. So she doesn't fit in at all with her family, and that's something that isn't her belief. It's just something intrinsic to her. In Whale Rider, Pykia is born female when her family was hoping for a male to sort of be the leader of their people. And this, again, it's something she does not have control over. It's an intrinsic trait. So Because it's so common for these characters to have been born different, for this discrimination or prejudice against them to have started at birth, we do frequently see these stories starting with birth stories or references to the birth or even showing the birth of the character. It's unlikely in a novel that you would do this, mainly because in a novel we sort of follow, typically we would say typically third limited is the more common point of view, or first person omniscient where we have that more distant point of view. It's less typical in modern novels. You can do it, but it's less typical. So normally we don't really show the birth of a character because they wouldn't remember it, they wouldn't be able to convey it or have any really thoughts about it. But you could still use references to the birth, whether through dialogue, side characters, whatever. Or you could start a little bit later on in childhood, or you can always incorporate flashbacks. So though this is more common in films to start with the birth, you can incorporate that idea and the function that it serves in the story to show how they've sort of had the odds stacked against them since they came into the world. I think that's something that you can still demonstrate in a novel. Now, so far we've only covered what the world sees as wrong with the character, so what the world doesn't like about the protagonist. But like I mentioned, they will still have their own belief, and that's important because they need to be contributing something to the story, something that society can kind of act against, and something that they can stand behind. That's not just an intrinsic trait. So we do want to see something coming from them that has some deeper value about who they are. So, for example, the status quo of Gattaca, as it continues, we see Vincent dreams of going into space, and his parents tell him that he'll never see the inside of a spaceship. You know, the only way he's ever going to see the inside of a spaceship is if he's cleaning it. They just do not believe in him at all. But he says that he might beat the odds of his genetics and that his potential might be greater than what was dictated by his DNA. And that is something that he believes, and it's something that we see him stand behind throughout the whole film. In Whale Rider, we also see that the Pykia was born female, so that's the intrinsic trait. She also really believes in the traditions of her people. She cares a lot about the culture, about traditions, and she works very hard and is very enthusiastic about it. So that's something that comes from her. We see this in the setup with her doing a traditional performance at school. And we do already see the lack of respect that the boys have for her. One of the boys sort of messes up the performance, and her father shows up late and sort of misses a lot of what she does in the performance. So Pykia believes in the values of and the value of the traditions of her people, even though a lot of the time her people, especially the males, don't believe in her, and particularly her grandfather doesn't believe in her because her grandfather was quite disappointed by her being born female. So, of course, normally in your traditional positive arc story, we would take this time to show or imply how the character needs to grow or change. So we want to set up that growth arc. But, of course, in the flat arc character, they're not going to change. So instead, with the flat arc characters, we want the reader or viewer to be on the protagonist's side. So we tend to set them up in a way that makes people feel very sympathetic towards them. We want the reader or viewer to be on their side, not on the side of society, not feeling that prejudice against them, or not feeling that they are not good enough. And there's often that very strong vibe of you're not good enough, you're not capable enough. And of course, we don't want the viewer or the reader to share that opinion. So it will be clear to the viewer or reader that the protagonist deserves better. And that will be a really strong message that will be brought across in the status quo. So that's one common presentation of the status quo in the flat arc. We're presented with a character with often an intrinsic trait that they don't have control over, that doesn't fit in with society, or that is discriminated against. And then we still come to see that they have a belief of their own that is beyond that, something that really comes from themselves. And typically they will have a belief that isn't valued by society, or that society is against in some way. But this isn't the only possible presentation of the status quo in the flat arc. So because these characters are often very steadfast and very happy-go-lucky, they're often, undyingly optimistic, another option for the status quo is, instead of showing how society is sort of keeping them down, you can instead show the immense benefits of their belief and how much it helps them and how great it makes their life. So, for example, in Legally Blonde, Elle Woods is getting ready for a date. She thinks that her boyfriend is going to propose. There's a montage. It's very upbeat and positive. In fact, the song that plays in that montage is called Perfect Day. So she's happy, she's popular, she's rich. We don't see anything obviously wrong at first. So we don't have to start with the birth of this individual being a disappointment or this really heaviness that we might see with the examples like with Matilda, Whale Rider, and Gattaca. We do, however, get a glimpse of things not being perfect for the characters. So when Elle goes shopping for a dress, the ladies in the shop sort of try to trick her into overpaying for a dress. She figures that out right away, but it really brings across the clear message, which is that society sees her as superficial and shallow and dumb and not capable when she really isn't that way at all. So society sort of assumes that traditionally feminine exterior means that she's dumb. So we do see that set up, even though it's a very upbeat, positive opening in general. Another example of an upbeat opening is in Paddington 2. That doesn't start with a birth story. It does start with an adoption type story, but as it moves on and we meet Paddington in his normal life, he's really happy. He's interacting positively with his friends and family, and even in the voiceover, he talks about how great and wonderful his life is. So things are very positive for him. And so this is a completely fine way of setting up the status quo as well. So it's another option. We can show the benefits of having such a positive viewpoint or having, just being such a good person, because the flat art characters were typically going to see someone who's just very good, very positive, or maybe a childlike innocence or an acceptance of other people, something generally admired. So those are two options that you can take for the status quo. Both are completely valid, and you can do what makes the most sense for your story and the story that you want to tell. So after the status quo, next we have the disruption, the debate, and the decision. So here things are going to get complicated right out of the gate. So because this is a flat arc story that we're telling, it's about a protagonist who does not have an arc, so they're not going to grow, but they are going to inspire at least one member of their world, their society, their family. They're going to inspire someone to have a growth arc. Usually that's going to be to become a better person. So because the character who has an arc is a separate character from the protagonist, they usually don't share the same plot points with the protagonist. So the story arc points are frequently not going to coincide perfectly with the plot point. So we've talked about this before with the positive arc, that sometimes the internal plot line, the character arc plot beats are maybe going to be a scene or two off from the external plot beats. And we will again see this with the flat arc, but it may look even more separate given the fact that the protagonist isn't even the one having the arc. So we might see a bigger divide between the plot beats and the internal beats or the arc beats that are going to apply to whoever the growth character is. Often it's not really that clean. It's often not just one character. We often will see this just sort of applied to society in general, with the whole of society or the whole of the world acting as the group having an arc sort of collectively. So because of that, there may be a duplication of plot beats. So we may often see a situation where the disruption, debate, and decision will have two distinct sequences. So we might have a sequence that applies to the protagonist and then followed by a sequence that applies to the world, society, or the larger group as a whole. Often the initial disruption, so let's start with just talking about the protagonist's disruption, decision, disruption, debate, decision. So, for example, in Gattaca, for Vincent, the disruption is when his parents decide to genetically select their next child. So they genetically select his brother, and his brother is given his father's name. So when he was born, he wasn't given his father's name because he was genetically inferior. So his little brother is given his father's name, and he sort of watches his brother Anton just be better than him at everything, and that sort of acts as his disruption. In Matilda, it's her realizing that she wants to go to school, not just sit at home all day signing packages for her parents. But of course, the disruption doesn't always have to occur in childhood. So in these examples, they occur in childhood before. In Gattaca, he does grow up, and the bulk of the story occurs in adulthood. And Matilda, of course, she grows up a little bit, and the bulk of the story occurs with her as an older child than when this is occurring. But that doesn't have to be the case. It's just, like I said, in film in particular, it's more common to sort of give the birth story and an early childhood story. But you don't have to do that. For example, in Legally Blonde, the whole plot line occurs in her adult life. We don't see her as a child at all. And Elle's disruption is when her boyfriend Warner, who she thinks is going to propose to her, actually breaks up with her for not being serious enough, where he sees her as not smart enough and not serious enough. So that's why he ends up breaking up with her. In most cases, this disruption is going to harshly highlight for the first time just how much society doesn't believe in this character. So it's not that they didn't know before this, but it's really harshly going to put it into a strong light. They're really going to see that demonstrated, that people just don't believe in them or are very discriminating against them. For example, Matilda's parents don't think she needs to go to school. Victor's parents in Gattaca, they value the genetically superior brother over him. They don't think that he has any value, or that he could even ever have a career that had any value or any meaning. So it's sort of this moment where for the first time, it's almost like the world's perception that they're inferior is being rubbed in their face, and it really hurts, and they really don't feel good about it. Elle, for example, ends up crying in bed, upset because of Warner breaking up with her. Matilda cries because she's lonely and she wants to go to school. In Gattaca, Vincent watches his genetically superior brother getting taller and beating him in everyday life. And so typically after the disruption, we would typically see a debate where the character would decide how or if they'll respond to the disruption. Because the flat arc character doesn't usually have as much agency, they don't typically have that much control over their own lives, sometimes because they're children and sometimes because they're just so discriminated against. They don't really have that same type of debate where they're not feeling like they really have any options. So that's why the reaction to the disruption tends to be more so sadness or maybe a little depression, but they're hurting. The disruption for them is that they're really seeing how much people don't believe in them, and then their debate is really just sort of hurting and feeling down about it. So we typically see like the traditional disruption effect, which is that their life gets worse, and that's what we would see with any kind of arc. Their life gets worse after the disruption in the vast majority of cases. So it might go without saying, though, but make sure that there is this tension between what the character wants and what society or their family will allow them to do. There has to be that tension in order to create a compelling disruption. So, Elle wants to get married to Warner. Warner breaks up with her. Matilda wants to go to school. Her parents don't want her to go to school. So just make sure that there is a tension there between what the character wants and what society, the group, the family is allowing them to do. So next we have the decision. So at the end of the debate, there's a decision. And here again, we see a bit of a difference from the traditional positive arc story. In the positive arc, the decision is typically made because the protagonist realizes that life is so unbearable and it's just not going to get any better. They realize they have to do something to achieve a more bearable situation. We don't really see that happening in the flat arc. What we typically see instead is that the flat arc character has a realization that they have more strength or a greater sense of agency than they previously thought. So they realize something that lets them take action in some way. In other words, they become the force to change their situation. And this realization, this decision that they make, this sparks the disruption for society. So that's why I was saying we get a sort of double arc. In many cases, we get a sort of double disruption, debate, decision that sparks a disruption, debate, decision for society. So, for example, Matilda's father accidentally implies that children can punish adults, and that sort of turns things on their head. It makes Matilda feel that she has a lot of agency, and also she starts to punish her father, which puts his world upside down. That disrupts his world. Elwood decides she can prove how serious and smart she is by going to Harvard. So that's her realization, that's her decision. And that defies and disrupts the expectations of her family, her friends, and the admissions board of Harvard. It sort of turns everyone else's lives upside down. In Gattaca, Vincent beats his genetically superior brother at a swimming contest, and that solidifies his belief that he really can have potential beyond his genetics, and that realization results in him leaving home and sort of turning things upside down. So it creates sort of a second disruption that's more focused on the external, on society, the world, etc. The flat arc character's decision, their realization about how they can have agency, means that they are suddenly acting different, and that is what disrupts or shakes up the world or society or the family or whatever. So in this section, we see the chaos created in the status quo of the other characters based on this realization, the decision that the protagonist made. So Matilda punishes her father by dyeing his hair and gluing his hat on his head. Elwood confuses her family who don't believe in her goal to go to Harvard. In Gattaca, Vincent runs away from home, sort of abandoning his family, and tries to make his own way in the world. So with this second debate now, so we've disrupted things, the character just making a decision, having a realization, disrupts things for society. The second debate, the question is more about the wider world or society in general. Will they yield to the character? Will the protagonist triumph over the prejudices of society? Will they get the thing that they want, or will they get to do the thing that they want? So in Legally Blonde, the question is, will Elle Woods get into Harvard? We get several scenes of her working towards this, studying, as well as a scene of the school considering her application. In Matilda, the question is, will Matilda's parents value her and her education? Will they put her in school? We see Matilda punishing her father, him refusing to put her in school, etc. In Gattaca, the question is, will Vincent's dream of going into space come true? We see him working as a janitor at the space station, dreaming of going up in the rockets. And so we have these questions of, will they get to do the thing that they want to do? So it's not really so much that the protagonist at this moment, they're not really deciding anything. They're not really having their own debate. We're just waiting to sort of see, is society going to let them do the thing that they want to do? So next we have the decision, and because the question in the second debate is whether society will yield to the protagonist or not, the decision is going to come from society, the world, the larger group, whatever. It's not going to come from the protagonist. And this feels okay because we did see the protagonist being proactive and working hard to achieve this, and because we do feel that because we've been, as the reader or viewer, made to feel sympathetic towards the character, we do believe that they deserve this thing. We think that this is something they have a right to, or something they've earned, something they deserve. So it doesn't feel like something just handed to them. You know, it doesn't feel like they got an accomplishment for nothing. It feels earned. So the decision, for example, is Harvard accepts Elle into law school. Matilda's father, after meeting the horrible principal, Miss Trunchbull, decides to put Matilda in school. Though the character doesn't have the control, like I said, we know that these things are earned. Interestingly, we do see a slight deviation from this in Gattaca. So though it does sort of have that two parts, nobody allows Vincent to achieve his dream because he has no way of exerting any influence over a society that just takes blood tests and doesn't let you do things if you're genetically inferior. So he can't really do a lot, and that's really what the film is about, is that he can't really do anything as his identity based on his genetic identity. So because of that, we don't really see anyone making a decision for Vincent, so he makes another decision, and his other decision is that he is going to try to assume the identity of someone else and someone who is genetically superior so that he can follow his dreams. Now, to make things even more complicated, but in the interest of covering all of the bases and all of the options, because I want you guys to really understand what you're allowed to do or able to do. You're allowed to do anything that you want, and all these are always guidelines, but just what the different presentations are, or the different things that the different options you might want to consider. This double sequence is not the only way to write the first quarter for the flat arc character. These plot points for the protagonist and for society as a whole can also be blended together. They don't have to be two distinct sequences. And this is probably pretty common when you have co-protagonists or multiple points of view, which is fairly common. So it's pretty typical to have a flat arc character paired with a growth arc character. It often facilitates telling the story a lot more. So we do tend to see co-protagonists quite often. For example, in Will Writer, it's about both Paikea, a flat arc character, and her grandfather Koro, a positive arc character. Their disruptions are only slightly apart from each other, so I'm going to walk through it just a little bit so you understand another option and what I mean by blending those plot points together. So Koro's disruption is when he finds out that his son has gotten a woman pregnant in another country and that his son doesn't intend to return home to provide an heir for their people, which was something Koro had still held out hope for and was really hoping would still occur. Paikea's disruption is when she overhears the argument that follows this, that between her grandfather Koro and her father. In that argument, the grandfather says that the father could just take Paikea back with him because Paikea has been living with the grandfather because he has no use for her and that she doesn't really have any value to him. So she overhears this and runs off upset. Her father talks to her and asks her to come stay with him and to go back to the other country where he has the pregnant girlfriend to live with them. And she debates about whether she should go or stay. So that's a more typical debate that we would expect. The grandfather Koro watches her as she's about to leave with her father, and he makes his decision, which is that he's going to start a school for the firstborns to try to find a new heir because his disruption happened. He realized his son's not ever going to provide an heir, so he's going to have to come up with another option. And then the decision he makes is to start a school for the firstborns to try to create an heir himself. So Paikea leaves with her father, but she feels drawn by the ocean back to her home, so she makes her decision then, and her decision is to stay home despite her grandfather not valuing her. So in this sequence of events, the plot points are very closely interwoven, but as you can see, they sort of alternate, and so we sort of get one disruption, the next disruption, one debate, the next debate. That is very, very common with two point of view characters. So rather than society sort of acting on the whole as sort of the character arc, the representation of that character arc, often we may use 2 points of view, one who has the growth arc and one who is the flat arc character who's sort of influencing the other characters. So that is another option. So whatever route you take at the end, whether you have two sequences, one sequence, or you have a blend of co-protagonists plot points together, once you get through the disruption, debate, decision, that will lead to the end of the first quarter and the first plot point. So the first plot point is when the character locks into their decision, whether that decision was made by them or by someone else. So the first plot point marks the entrance into the world of the second quarter. So Elwood goes to Harvard, Matilda goes to school, Paikea runs to tell her grandfather that she's staying home and that she's not leaving with her father. Meanwhile, Koro is setting up the school for the firstborn sons. Vincent meets with the man who is going to help him assume another man's identity. So it's sort of this step towards the new world. They are taking on this new challenge. So that brings us to the second quarter. We talked previously about how in positive arc stories in the second quarter, the character is the same person, but in a different circumstance because they haven't actually learned anything or grown at all. So in the flat arc, of course, the character isn't going to grow ever, so we're not trying to set up that they're going to grow, but it still applies in the sense that the character is the same person in a new circumstance, but that new circumstance holds the same beliefs as their old circumstance. So we're not going to see them in a situation where all of a sudden that discrimination is gone and all of a sudden, everything is great for them. Normally, we're not going to see something like that happen. I never say never, but we don't normally see that. We normally see them in a new situation where that belief is still being held, but now potentially by a different group of people. So that doesn't mean that everyone has to be against them. I mentioned this when we went over the general overview video of the flat arc. They will tend to have friends that do align with them. They'll typically have allies, so everybody doesn't have to be against them, but the general overall vibe is still that society doesn't share their belief. So the first plot beat in the second quarter is the upside down world. And as we would expect in the more traditional positive character arc, with the flat arc, we still see the protagonist enter the upside down world with usually a change of location or at least a change of circumstances. And we get a scene or up to a few scenes of the character learning how this new world works and sort of what's different about it than when compared to their old world or the world of the first quarter. So there's also often a polarity shift here. So if the world in the first quarter was positive, in the second quarter it will be more negative, and vice versa. Another way to look at this is that the flat arc protagonist will either be more adapted to the world of the second quarter or less adapted to the world of the second quarter. And a shift either direction, it works perfectly fine, because what we want to show is that things are different. This is a different situation, a new experience for the flat arc protagonist. It doesn't matter if it's more positive or more negative, as much as it matters that it's different. But like I said, that general belief is still going to be oppressing them. The general belief of society or of the group is still going to be oppressing them. So we're not going to see them entering a situation where it's positive and everything just becomes super easy. But it may still be more positive than their previous situation. So let's go over some examples to make this clearer. So some examples of shifts from positive environment of the first quarter to negative environment in the second quarter is Paddington 2. So in the first quarter, he's surrounded by family and friends. In his hometown, he sort of, it's a predominantly positive vibe, though he has some setbacks and some complications. In the first quarter, it's predominantly a positive vibe. But in the second quarter, he goes to prison, where we see that he's, it's not this bright, charming, happy place like his hometown. His family is not there, and it doesn't look like the other inmates are going to want to be his friends. So it's a more negative environment. Another example is in Legally Blonde. Elle goes from popular sorority girl surrounded by friends in the first quarter to Harvard in the second quarter, where she attracts negative attention for her clothes, her interest in socializing, and just it generally doesn't look like people are going to want to be her friend. Also notice that these are the same characters who had a more positive experience in the first quarter. So like I said, you can start with the status quo being more focused on the benefits of the flat arc character's belief. Those are the same characters who we tend to see now entering a more negative situation in the second quarter. A somewhat subtler example is in Whale Rider. So in Whale Rider, Pykia does not change locations. Like I said, she chooses to stay home, so she chooses to just stay where she was. But we do see the introduction of a new set piece, a new location, which is this school her grandfather sets up for the firstborn sons. So her grandfather, Koro, rejects her from the school for being female, whereas in the first quarter, we saw her participating in the traditions of her people. So all of a sudden now she's extremely excluded. So though she wasn't taken seriously in the first quarter, so again, we see the belief is the same, it's actually gotten worse now, and she's more fully excluded. But that shift can go the other way as well. So we can also have a second quarter where the world of the second quarter is more positive and the character was more miserable in the first quarter. A good example of this is in Matilda. So it is, again, a somewhat subtle shift, and we're really talking mostly about fairly subtle shifts here, with the exception of the extremely positive openings like we saw with Legally Blonde and Paddington. But usually the shift's a little bit subtle. So in Matilda, she's very lonely and uncared for in the first quarter. We actually see her being really sad and crying because she is lonely and wants friends. In the second quarter, she goes to school for the first time, where she meets her wonderful teacher, Miss Honey, and she starts to have her education supported, and she immediately makes friends, and that's all super positive and an improvement. However, of course, there is a major negative aspect with Miss Trunchbull, the scary disciplinarian principal. But if you pay attention to the vibe, despite the school being very scary, Miss Trunchbull being very scary, and Miss Trunchbull not supporting her education, the overall vibe is more positive. Matilda is smiling, she's happy, she has friends, she comes home excited to talk about the day that she had. So we see a big improvement despite the fact that there are major downsides and major negatives to this new environment as well. So next we have Fish Out of Water. So in a positive arc story, in this section, we will see the character starting to realize that they're not going to gain anything from sticking with their belief. They're going to start to feel punished for sticking to their belief. But of course, we're not talking about a positive arc character, we're talking about a flat arc character. And so this still basically applies, because they're still not seeing any benefit to holding on to their belief, but they're also not really surprised necessarily by that as much as the positive arc character. We might see them being a little bit more put off or a little bit more surprised that they're not benefiting from it. But again, it depends very much on the story, so I do have to sometimes just make broad generalizations, so don't take what I'm saying as gospel. I'm trying to make generalizations to make this as easy to understand as possible. So what we will tend to see is that society will feel really unfair. The same as in the first quarter, we're going to see society continuing to feel unfair. And we're going to really start to get the sense in the second quarter that it's society that needs to change, that society would really benefit from changing, and then that would make it a more fair environment for the protagonist. This doesn't mean that the character is inactive in this quarter. The protagonist is still trying to improve or make the best of their circumstances. We just don't see this paying off for them in the second quarter. And the fault for that will very clearly be society or the larger group. It will not be the fault of the character. It will be the fault of society or general discrimination against them. For example, in Will Rider, Pykia watches her grandfather Koro teaching the firstborn sons, and she sort of practices the things outside the windows in secret. We know that that's not fair, that she's not participating in this, so we get a very clear vibe that though she's not making progress, it's society's fault. In Legally Blonde, a professor scoffs at Elle's clothes, and she gets kicked out of class for not being prepared. And then also we see that Warner is dating a new girl, Vivian, who he thinks is more serious. So he sort of replaced her with this more serious, more practical in her clothing woman. And we get the sense that that's not really fair, that he was really judging her on her appearance. The protagonist is a fish out of water in the sense that they are not fitting in. We see a continuation and even an exaggeration or an increase in how the character was being judged. So it may be that they're judged even more overtly or even harsher, or what characters say about them may become even meaner in the second quarter. An interesting presentation of this is in Gattaca. So Vincent's life improves dramatically after he assumes another man's identity. So he assumes the identity of someone who has superior genes to him. And then all of a sudden he's able to get his dream job. Things are really looking up for him. But this doesn't have anything to do with his beliefs. So society is not yielding to him. No one in the second quarter is going to have society yielding to their belief or taking on their belief. So even though it seems like things look up for Vincent, it doesn't have anything to do with his belief. It's entirely because he's tricked people into thinking that he is someone else genetically. So next we have New World, New Problems. This is where we will see the antagonistic force of sort of flexing its power. The threat of what there is to lose will be felt. We also see that the efforts the protagonist has put into their new environment or circumstances aren't paying off. They haven't, we already know they haven't been paying off. But this is a moment that really puts that in a harsh light where it's like really clear that things are not paying off for them. So in Will Rider, Pykia's grandfather catches her practicing sort of the stick fighting that he is training the firstborn sons to do, and he gets really angry with her. We see that her commitment and interest in the traditions of her people is not rewarded. It's not recognized. Matilda, I would say we could say that there are two moments in this section because there are now two antagonists, her parents and Miss Trunchbull. So first we have Miss Honey coming to her house talking to her parents about going to college. Her parents sort of make fun of Miss Honey and say, like, you know, Matilda doesn't need to go to college, like that's goofy. And so we see that they're not taking her education any more seriously. We also see Trunchbull making Bruce Bogtrotter eat the chocolate cake, which shows, again, neither antagonist has shifted at all. We're not seeing any improvement, and we're seeing a really harsh demonstration of how things are just not getting any better for the character. In Legally Blonde, Elle shows up to a party tricked into wearing a bunny costume, and then people make fun of her, and then Warner, her ex-boyfriend, tells her she isn't smart enough to get the internship that she wants. So despite how hard she's worked, despite the fact that she's doing something everybody else is doing, we can see people still don't accept her, and she's not any closer to being accepted or taken seriously. In Gattaca, someone at work is murdered, and we see that one of Vincent's eyelashes is found as evidence. And though he didn't do the murder, we can infer that because he is genetically inferior, he is way more likely to get blamed. So there's that fear created by the fact that they have his eyelash. So basically the message is still that no matter how hard he works, his genetics at the end of the day are still going to hold him back. So we could say the general message of this society is we won't accept you no matter how hard you try. It doesn't matter how hard you work. Things are never going to work out for you. That's the basic vibe or message of this section. But despite the protagonist feeling down and discouraged, this moment usually sparks a recommitment to their belief and to their goals. And it's sort of a fine then, I'll do it anyway kind of moment. So it's often there's this sort of triumphant, I'm going to go get them anyway reaction to this. So that leads us to the gaining mastery beat. This is where we will start to see things shifting a little bit. Things start looking up, often because the tenacious flat arc character takes that threat of the antagonist that they felt in the previous plot beat and uses it as inspiration to work even harder, to sort of double down. They've gotten used to this new world, and now they're going to really dig into their beliefs and really shoot for their goal. So in Legally Blonde, rather than caving to Warner, not thinking she can succeed in the internship, she works even harder. She buys a computer, she studies super hard, she answers a question better than Warner does in class. In Will Rider, Pykia goes to her uncle and asks her uncle to help her to learn the traditional stick fighting that her grandfather was teaching, even though he doesn't believe in her doing this and doesn't want her to do this. In Matilda, she stands up for the Trunchbull by cheering for Bruce and helping him succeed in eating the whole chocolate cake. We also see her enjoying having friends, which is an important part of what she wanted. In Paddington 2, the inmates say that they'll forgive Paddington for accidentally dyeing their clothes pink if he's able to change the menu, the horrible menu at the prison. Paddington successfully confronts Knuckles, the chef, by sticking his marmalade sandwich into his mouth. Knuckles loves it, and he takes Paddington under his protection. So Paddington sort of just sticking to who he was results in him getting a positive benefit. So the success here is due to the characters' tenacity, to sticking with their guns. They aren't growing, they aren't changing, they aren't succeeding because they're trying something new. It's just that now that they've stuck to their guns for long enough, then they sort of doubled down and tried even harder. Now they're finally starting to see a little bit of success and a little bit of payoff for that. So that takes us to the end of the second quarter, where we have the midpoint. In a positive arc, the midpoint will be a moment when the protagonist has a partial realization about how they need to change and who they need to become in order to succeed. But we won't see this in the flat arc because the character doesn't need to change. So like with many of the plot points, we kind of have to flip it on its head a little bit, focusing on who does need to change, which is society or the group or the world on the whole. So because the world doesn't yet embrace them at the midpoint, so we're not going to see this big shift, a crack is created, a sort of opening is created for them to be perceived more positively later on. So this might look like the character earning an opportunity or gaining a position that others see them as unfit for. So for example, in Legally Blonde, Elle gets the internship. She successfully achieves this big accomplishment that she wanted, and she's going to have the opportunity to work on a court case with her Professor Callahan, despite no one taking her seriously, but she's now in this higher position. We might also see the protagonist making a difference in their world for the first time. For example, Matilda uses her powers to make a glass with a newt in it tip over, and the newt gets on Miss Trunchbull. She acts sort of goofy and crazy, and the kids sort of laugh at her. And for the first time, Trunchbull is seen as not quite as intimidating. So this is the first glimpse we get of Matilda making a difference in her world. In Paddington 2, he serves the marmalade sandwiches to all of the inmates who are used to the disgusting prison food. They all love it, and this sparks happiness in the inmates that previously wasn't seen. And for the first time, Paddington has actually made a difference in his environment. Even if the protagonist does make a difference in the environment, the midpoint often isn't all positive. So, for example, in Will Rider, Pi successfully disarms the best of the firstborn boys, the one that her grandfather thought was most promising to be the leader, but she disarms him, and this shows that she can be successful, even more successful than the best of the boys, but her grandfather gets extremely upset with her, sort of yells at her and forces her to apologize. So it's not this purely positive experience. Similarly, in Matilda, despite her triumph being positive, it also causes the Trunchbull to sort of suspect her of tipping the glass over on purpose, and this sort of puts a target on her back. So we can expect this shift at the midpoint to come with new challenges. In particular, commonly it's going to rile up the antagonist a bit. Also, this shift towards being able to influence the world isn't always possible in every story. So That's the reason why I included Gattaca in this video, was because I wanted you guys to know that sometimes it's not possible to follow exactly the typical expected structure or script that we would see for the flat arc characters. So Vincent's in a different situation because he's secretly fighting against the injustices of the world by posing as someone genetically superior. So he can't overtly change the world or their perception of this supposed genetic lower class, because nobody knows that he is in the genetic lower class. So a lot of what we typically see done can't really be done because of that, because he's hiding his identity. He's trying to blend in. But in this case, Vincent hears that they are investigating the owner of the dropped eyelash that they now know belongs to someone genetically inferior. They don't yet know that it was him, but they found it at the murder scene. So he's realizing that they are going to be looking for him. So his ability to hide who he is now is at risk. So this is your more traditional plot-driven midpoint, where it creates a clear shift in the character's actions moving forward. He can't just wait to go into space now and achieve his dream. Vincent will have to try not to be caught so that he doesn't get in trouble for posing as somebody else. But in most cases, we will see something closer to Paddington 2 or to Matilda, where the character is able to inject a little bit of themselves in their own values into the world for the first time, and that will generally mark a sort of upward trajectory for them. So that is the halfway point. So that is where I'm going to leave it for today. We will pick up in the next video with the second half of plot structure. If you want to help support the channel, I do have a Patreon. Eventually, a cheat sheet for the flat arc will go up on Patreon after the second video comes out. And there are lots of other cheat sheets and things on there as well. We also have a Discord at the $2 and up tier. So the cheat sheets are at the $5 and up tier. The Discord's at the $2 and up tier. And I also do a podcast every other week on the $5 and up tier if that's something that interests you. And your support really makes this channel possible for me and is really, really appreciated. So if that's something you're interested in, the link will be in the description. I will be back with part 2 probably in a week or two at most. And in the meantime, happy writing, guys.